The battlefield at night, smoke and dust, artillery shells exploding in endless succession, the SEAL team surrounded, radio silent, atmosphere drowning in despair. A soldier whispers, "We're done! No air support, no way out!" Every eye drops down, accepting fate like a bitter pill. Suddenly, a roar tears the sky apart. An A-10 charges forward, screaming like thunder, cutting through the darkness. Have you ever misjudged someone until they appeared, right when no one dared believe anymore? Before I tell you what really happened that day, make sure you're subscribed and leave a comment below, letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now let's find out. Meet Captain Elena Ramirez, 34 years old. Brown hair tied back tight, determined eyes that usually get lost in the crowd. She moved through the base like someone who'd learned that invisibility was safer than attention, that blending in meant avoiding judgment. A-10 pilot, but her career had been frozen after a training accident that nobody talked about anymore. The kind of incident that follows you like a shadow, whispering doubt into every conversation about your capabilities. How others saw her painted a picture of professional exile. Colleagues whispered behind her back, "She screwed up that whole mission. Who would give her another chance?" The words carried the casual cruelty of people who'd never faced the weight of split-second decisions that could cost lives. She'd been labeled the safe female pilot, relegated to logistics, never allowed on the front lines. Her flight jacket hung in her locker like a museum piece, gathering dust while others earned combat hours and recognition. Her daily habits revealed a woman making peace with limitation. At the base, she usually sat quietly in the military cafe, reading technical manuals that others considered boring. While pilots shared war stories and mission debriefs, Elena absorbed every detail about aircraft systems, weather patterns, and tactical innovations. Knowledge became her refuge when opportunity was denied. She spoke little, never argued, just worked silently through each day. When younger pilots complained about regulations or equipment limitations, Elena listened without comment. She'd learned that opinions were dangerous when your reputation was already fragile. But details revealed something extraordinary beneath the ordinary surface. Once, when the radar system malfunctioned during pre-flight checks, Elena quietly identified the problem in 10 seconds, saving the entire squadron from taking off in dangerous conditions. Her diagnosis was precise, her solution elegant, her explanation clear and concise. Others were surprised, but then they moved on. Heroes are supposed to be loud and obvious. Quiet competence gets forgotten in the noise of military bureaucracy and masculine bravado. The incident became another story that people almost remembered. Another moment when Elena proved herself to people who weren't really paying attention. She'd stopped expecting recognition years ago. Instead, she focused on being ready. Ready for the moment that might never come. Ready to prove herself to people who'd already made up their minds. Ready to save lives that belonged to people who didn't know her name. Her apartment was Spartan except for one wall covered with technical diagrams, weather charts, and tactical scenarios. She studied them like a monk studies scripture, finding meaning in the details that others overlooked. Late at night, when the base grew quiet, Elena would sit by her window and watch aircraft taking off for missions she'd never be assigned. Each departure was a reminder of the career that had been taken from her, but also preparation for the career she might still claim. The chapter concluded with crisis approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. A raid mission had failed catastrophically. SEALs were pinned down in a valley that had become their tomb. The terrain was impossible, the enemy well-positioned, and hope was bleeding out with each passing minute. They called for air support, but everyone was busy, committed to other operations, or grounded by weather conditions that made flying suicidal. Only one pilot remained available, someone nobody thought to consider. Elena Ramirez, the woman they'd forgotten, was still a warrior, waiting for war to remember her name. The base communications center buzzed with desperate radio chatter, but no solutions. Time was running out for men who'd never learned how to surrender, trapped by circumstances that demanded a miracle they couldn't provide for themselves. In her quiet corner of the base, Elena heard every word and felt something stirring that had been dormant too long. The hunger to fly into danger for people who needed saving more than they needed their doubts about who should be doing the saving. The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. The SEAL team found themselves trapped between heavy machine gun fire and mountainous terrain that offered no escape routes. They'd walked into what military strategists call a perfect kill box. Enemy forces held the high ground, overlapping fields of fire, and all the patience in the world to wait for their trapped prey to run out of ammunition. No air asset available, the radio crackled with the finality of a death sentence. The operations center had exhausted every option, contacted every available pilot, and received the same response. Negative, negative, negative. Ground control sounded exhausted. All aircraft committed to Operation Desert Shield. Weather conditions deteriorating. No backup available. In the valley below, America's finest warriors faced the unthinkable reality that their legendary training and equipment couldn't overcome basic tactical mathematics. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. That's when Elena appeared, moving through the operations center like someone who'd made a decision that transcended permission or protocol. She approached the duty officer with quiet determination. "Sir, requesting immediate clearance for emergency air support mission." The response was automatic dismissal. "Ramirez, you're not on the rotation. Besides, conditions are too dangerous for—" He stopped mid-sentence, seeing something in her eyes that made arguments irrelevant. Elena was already walking toward the flight line. She climbed into the cockpit of an aging A-10 Thunderbolt that mechanics had dubbed Old Reliable, an aircraft that had seen better decades but still possessed the brutal effectiveness that made the platform legendary among ground forces who needed close air support. Her hands found the controls with the muscle memory of thousands of hours in flight simulators and the few combat missions she'd been allowed before her career was derailed. The engine spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder, vibrating through her bones and reminding her why she'd become a pilot in the first place. She whispered to herself, "Not today." The phrase carried the weight of every mission she'd been denied, every doubt she'd absorbed, every night she'd wondered if her career was over before it had really begun. Today would be different. Today, competence would matter more than reputation. The takeoff was textbook perfect, but what followed was pure artistry. Elena dove the A-10 into the valley with the kind of aggressive precision that separated good pilots from great ones. The aircraft responded to her touch like an extension of her own nervous system. Every control input calculated to maximize effectiveness while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon opened up with its distinctive sound, a mechanical roar that enemy forces had learned to fear more than any other weapon in the American arsenal. The 30-millimeter rounds impacted the mountainside where machine gun nests had been systematically destroying everything the SEALs tried to do. The entire battlefield fell silent for a moment, as if both sides needed time to process what was happening. The SEALs, who'd been preparing to make their last stand, looked up with expressions that mixed hope with disbelief. "Who the hell is flying that hog?" The question carried wonder instead of criticism. When you're facing death, you don't care about the gender or reputation of your savior. Elena didn't explain. She just executed. Her first pass eliminated the heavy machine gun position that had the SEALs pinned against the valley wall. The second pass took out the mortar team that had been dropping high-explosive rounds with methodical precision. Her third pass cut the enemy supply line, trapping their forces in the same tactical box they'd created for the Americans. Each attack run was a masterclass in close air support, low enough to be devastatingly accurate, fast enough to avoid concentrated anti-aircraft fire, precisely timed to give the ground forces windows of opportunity to maneuver. The A-10's armor absorbed small arms fire, while Elena positioned the aircraft to provide maximum protection for the troops below. She used the mountainous terrain like a chess player uses pieces, turning obstacles into advantages through superior understanding of three-dimensional tactics. Radio chatter from the ground revealed the transformation taking place below. "Whoever's flying that bird knows exactly what they're doing. We've got movement. We've got hope." Elena's flying was poetry written in controlled violence. Every maneuver deliberate, every shot calculated, every decision made by someone who understood that in combat, there's no difference between technical excellence and human survival. The enemy began withdrawing from positions they'd held with confidence just minutes earlier. Professional fighters know when tactical advantage has shifted beyond recovery, when staying means dying for nothing. Through it all, Elena's radio remained silent. No dramatic declarations, no requests for recognition, just the methodical execution of close air support that was saving lives one precise cannon burst at a time. From the ground, a SEAL's voice crackled through the static. Guardian Angel, you are cleared hot on all targets. How copy?" Elena's response was professionally terse. "Copy all ground units. Maintaining overwatch. Stay low and move when I tell you." But one SEAL whispered a question that would echo long after the smoke cleared. "Wait, who's the pilot?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the battlefield below. A young officer in the operations center whispered to his colleague, "You don't know her? That's Elena Ramirez." His voice carried the weight of someone sharing a story that had been buried under bureaucracy and forgotten by people who should have remembered. The truth about Elena began unfolding like a classified document, finally seeing daylight. She hadn't always been the invisible pilot relegated to safe assignments and forgotten in corner offices. Once, she'd been the most promising aviator in her class, breaking records for low-altitude night flying that had instructors shaking their heads in amazement rather than concern. Her reputation had been built on steel nerves and an intuitive understanding of aircraft that went beyond technical knowledge into something approaching artistry. She could make an A-10 dance through mountain passes that other pilots avoided, could place ordnance with surgical precision while taking fire that would rattle veterans twice her age. The brass had noticed. Elena Ramirez was selected for special operations, the kind of missions that don't appear in official records and don't get discussed outside of secure briefing rooms. Her name appeared on classified rosters alongside the most elite pilots in the Air Force. But then came the incident that changed everything. During a mission 18 months earlier, her wingman had been shot down over hostile territory. Enemy surface-to-air missiles had found their target despite electronic countermeasures and evasive maneuvers that should have been sufficient against the threat they'd been briefed to expect. Elena had watched her friend's aircraft spiral toward the ground in a trail of smoke and debris, had heard his final radio transmission cut short by impact and silence. The rescue operation that followed recovered a body instead of a survivor. The official investigation cleared Elena of any wrongdoing. The after-action report stated that she'd followed protocols, maintained proper formation, and responded appropriately to the threat environment. No fault, no blame, no responsibility assigned to the woman who'd returned alone from a mission that had launched with 2 aircraft. But Elena assigned herself a different verdict. She carried the guilt like shrapnel that couldn't be extracted, a wound that healed on the surface but remained infected underneath. If I'd intervened sooner, if I had seen the missile launch, if I'd warned him faster. The questions tortured her through sleepless nights and distracted days. She'd requested transfer to rear area assignments, voluntarily removing herself from the front lines where her skills were needed most. When colleagues asked why, she gave bureaucratic answers about career development and professional diversification. The truth was simpler and more painful. She was afraid of making another mistake that would cost someone else their life. The transfer was approved without question. The Air Force had plenty of pilots eager for combat assignments, and Elena's request for support roles was processed as routine administrative business. Nobody asked deeper questions about why their most talented close air support pilot wanted to spend her career in logistics and training. Elena disappeared into the background of military life, becoming another face in briefing rooms and another name on duty rosters. She attended meetings, filed reports, and maintained aircraft that other people flew into combat, while she watched from safe distances that felt like exile. The isolation was self-imposed but no less real. She avoided social gatherings where combat pilots shared stories she couldn't tell anymore. She ate meals alone while listening to conversations about missions she'd never be assigned. She became an expert on every regulation and technical specification, while forgetting what it felt like to push an aircraft to its limits in service of something larger than procedure. But competence is like water. It finds a way to surface even when buried under layers of bureaucracy and self-doubt. Elena continued studying, continued preparing, continued maintaining her skills through simulation and technical training that she pursued with the dedication of someone who still hoped for redemption. She knew every modification to the A-10 platform, every tactical development in close air support, every lesson learned from conflicts she wasn't allowed to participate in. Her apartment became a private war college where she analyzed after-action reports, studied enemy tactics, and developed theoretical solutions to problems she'd never be asked to solve. The work was academic until suddenly it wasn't. When the SEAL team found themselves trapped in an impossible tactical situation, Elena's months of preparation converged with opportunity in a way that demanded action over authorization. She hadn't asked permission because she'd already decided that some situations transcend protocol. When lives were at stake and no other options existed, technical expertise and combat readiness mattered more than career safety and institutional approval. The young officer finished his explanation. She was the best we had. Then she disappeared into logistics after losing her wingman. Nobody expected her to volunteer for anything dangerous again. His colleague asked the obvious question. So why did she? The answer came from Elena herself, her voice crackling through the radio as she continued providing air support. Because some things are more important than being afraid. And because nobody else was coming. The truth was that Elena had never stopped being a warrior. She'd just been waiting for war to remember that warriors come in many forms, and sometimes the best ones are the ones who've learned that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and acting anyway when people are counting on you to do what others can't or won't. Today, Elena Ramirez had stopped hiding from her own capabilities. The silence that followed Elena's mission was different from the silence that had surrounded her career for months. When she taxied the A-10 back to the flight line, ground crew members who'd barely acknowledged her existence were waiting with the kind of attention usually reserved for returning heroes. They didn't say much. Military culture doesn't always require words to communicate respect, but their actions spoke volumes. The SEALs she'd saved arrived at the base 3 hours later, transported by helicopter from the extraction point where Elena's air support had made their rescue possible. They moved with the deliberate motions of men who'd survived something that should have killed them, carrying their gear with hands that still trembled slightly from adrenaline and relief. As Elena climbed down from her cockpit, sweat-stained flight suit clinging to her frame, hair escaped from regulation constraints, the SEALs formed an informal line. No orders given, no ceremony planned, just professional soldiers recognizing what had happened and who had made it happen. They didn't applaud, they didn't cheer. They executed perfect salutes with the precision of men who understood that some moments require formal acknowledgement of extraordinary service under impossible conditions. Elena returned the salutes, her own movements carrying the exhaustion that comes after hours of high-stress flying, mixed with the satisfaction of missions accomplished and lives saved. The exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it represented a transformation that would echo through both their careers and the broader military community. The details of recognition came quietly, organically, without official pronouncement or public ceremony. Someone placed a hot cup of coffee on Elena's usual table in the military cafe. No words exchanged, no explanation offered. The gesture was simple but profound in a culture where such courtesies had to be earned through actions that transcended normal expectations. A maintenance technician quietly taped a photograph of an A-10 to the wall of the pilot's ready room, with a handwritten notation, "Guardian Angel." The image wasn't officially sanctioned, but it remained undisturbed by supervisors who understood that morale sometimes requires informal recognition of informal heroics. The community response was measured but meaningful, reflecting military values that prize competence over drama, results over rhetoric. They stopped calling her the quiet pilot in conversations that assumed she couldn't hear. The whispers changed from skepticism to respect. "She's the one who came back." The phrase carried multiple meanings. She'd returned from a mission others wouldn't have attempted, and she'd returned to active flying after months of self-imposed exile. Elena maintained her customary modesty throughout the transformation. She walked the same corridors, carrying the same technical manuals, sitting in the same corner of the cafe where she'd always preferred solitude to socializing. Her routine remained unchanged except for one significant detail. The eyes that followed her movements now carried respect instead of curiosity or dismissal. Younger pilots began asking questions about close air support tactics that Elena answered with the patience of someone who'd learned that sharing knowledge was more important than protecting reputation. Her informal instruction sessions became legendary among aviators who recognized expertise when they encountered it. The conversations were technical rather than personal, focused on aircraft capabilities and tactical applications, rather than the emotional weight of Elena's return to combat flying. She preferred it that way. Professional discussion felt safer than personal recognition, and she'd always been more comfortable with confidence than with celebrity. But the change was undeniable. Elena Ramirez had reclaimed her identity as a combat pilot through actions that spoke louder than any official rehabilitation could have managed. She'd proven to herself and others that past mistakes didn't define future potential, that courage could be recovered along with confidence, and that the best pilots were often those who understood both the cost of failure and the value of precision. The SEAL team had been saved by someone they'd never met, flying an aircraft they'd probably never fly, demonstrating skills they'd never master. But they understood the universal language of professionals doing difficult jobs under dangerous conditions, and they recognized excellence regardless of its source. Elena never officially returned to frontline operations in the way that careers are typically managed through assignments and promotions and formal recognition ceremonies. She didn't seek higher positions or demand combat postings that would restore her previous status. The bureaucratic machinery of military personnel management continued operating as if she remained the logistics coordinator who filed reports and attended briefings about other people's missions. But every time danger emerged, something remarkable happened. People began looking toward the sky and asking each other, "Is she still out there?" The question became shorthand for hope that help might arrive from unexpected sources when official channels failed to provide adequate solutions. Elena's name began appearing in informal communications between ground forces and flight operations, not in official requests, but in the kind of military folklore that spreads through back channels and word-of-mouth recommendations. Soldiers who'd never met her personally knew that somewhere on the base was a pilot who'd saved an entire SEAL team without being asked and without seeking credit. The icon emerged organically from competence demonstrated under pressure. Her A-10 silhouette cutting through afternoon clouds became a symbol that transcended the specific mission she'd flown. Younger service members began using phrases like guardian angel to describe the kind of air support they hoped for when situations became desperate. The legend grew through repetition and embellishment, as military stories tend to do when they capture something essential about courage and capability that resonates beyond specific details of time and place. Elena became the pilot who could appear when needed most, who could perform impossible missions that others wouldn't attempt, who represented the possibility that rescue might arrive from sources that bureaucracy had forgotten or overlooked. The reality was more modest, but no less significant. She continued working in her assigned role, maintaining aircraft and supporting operations that other pilots flew. But she also volunteered for additional duties that kept her flying skills sharp and her tactical knowledge current. She attended briefings she wasn't required to attend, studied mission reports from conflicts she wasn't participating in, and maintained readiness for opportunities that might never come again. Her apartment still displayed the technical charts and tactical analyses that had sustained her during months of professional exile. But now they served a different purpose, not escape from reality, but preparation for responsibility that she'd reclaimed through actions rather than paperwork. The transformation was internal as much as external. Elena had learned to live with the guilt of her wingman's death without allowing it to paralyze her capacity for future action. She discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear when action was necessary. The base community began incorporating her story into informal training discussions, not as official doctrine, but as example of how individual initiative could fill gaps that institutional procedures couldn't address. Young aviators heard about the pilot who'd saved a SEAL team and learned that heroism often looked different than they'd expected. Quieter, more methodical, focused on results rather than recognition. The story became shorthand for the kind of military professionalism that prioritized mission success over personal safety, that valued competence over protocol when lives were at stake. Elena's legacy was captured in conversations that happened after official briefings ended, when experienced personnel shared wisdom that couldn't be found in regulation manuals or training curricula. They talked about the importance of staying ready even when opportunities seemed unlikely, about maintaining skills that might be needed in situations that couldn't be predicted, about the difference between career management and service to others who depended on your capabilities. The hanging flight suit in Elena's locker became its own symbol, not retirement from flying, but readiness to fly, when circumstances required someone willing to risk everything for people they'd probably never meet personally. Young pilots passing her quarters would see the gear arranged with military precision, always ready for immediate deployment, representing the possibility that heroism might be required without advance notice or official authorization. The phrase that emerged from her story was simple but powerful. Not every hero needs a medal. Some just need to show up right when it matters most. Elena Ramirez had shown up. The people she'd saved would never forget. The community she'd served would never look at quiet competence the same way again. She'd proven that some victories matter more than recognition, that some missions succeed precisely because they're undertaken by people who care more about results than credit. Comment the hanging coat. If you believe there's always someone ready to come back when no one else dares to stand up. Subscribe to HL Stories if you believe not every hero needs a medal. Some just need to show up right when it matters most.